Good afternoon. My name is Evan Stankovics, Adult Programming Librarian at the Northside Library, and on behalf of Jefferson Madison Regional Library, welcome to the virtual program, Recycling and Composting, Let's Do It Right. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please do remember to keep checking jmrl.org for a complete and frequently updated schedule of virtual programs for all ages. This event and all JMRL events have been made possible by the incredible and generous support of the Friends of the Library. This program is also being recorded for inclusion on the JMRL YouTube channel. So if you'd like to rewatch this program or have a friend who couldn't attend, barring any major technical issues, we will try to get this posted within the next couple of days. For anyone curious, the mics have been muted for this afternoon's event. Toward the end of the program, we will designate about 15-20 minutes for a Q&A. We ask that any questions you may have during the course of the program that you please enter into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or if you prefer to ask your question aloud, that you please utilize the raise hand feature. This feature can be accessed by selecting participants at the bottom of your screen and then clicking raise hand. If you've dialed in by phone today, you would simply press *9 to activate the raise hand feature. Again, in the interest of time, we ask that you please save all questions until the Q&A session at the end, and we will address as many as possible during that time. With that said, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you today's presenters. From the Albemarle County Solid Waste Alternatives Advisory Committee, we welcome Peggy Gilges and Christine Putnam here to discuss the do's and don'ts of recycling and composting. I've had an opportunity here in a abridged run through this program, and it is incredibly informative and very enlightening. And I want to thank you both so much for conducting this. And when you are ready, I think we can probably get started.
Okay. Thank you very much, Evan. I'm Peggy Gilges. And Christine and I are very happy to be here today to talk with you about recycling and composting in Albemarle County. We have a lot of slides to go through, and we're going to turn off our video screens to go through the slide presentation, and then we'll be back with you for the Q&A portion in about 30-35 minutes. So thank you, and let's start. So we're starting with a slide of an aerial view of Albemarle's former landfill out on Dick Woods Road. This is the Ivy MUC, or Ivy Material Utilization Center. It was used for decades by the city, County of Albemarle, and the University of Virginia. The landfill was closed in 2001 as a result of a lawsuit, Weber versus Ravenna Solid Waste Authority, which alleged violations of federal and state environmental laws, including contamination of off-site wells. Today, the Ivy Material Utilization Center is a transfer station, and the care of the closed landfill is provided by Ravenna Solid Waste Authority. I want to make a point that you can't just bury trash and leave it. It has to be managed in perpetuity. Although landfills are an accepted means of dealing with the trash we make, they're an imperfect solution. There are two things that about landfills that need to be monitored continually. One is methane emissions. Methane emissions result from the anaerobic decomposition of organic waste in the landfill. And methane is a greenhouse gas 34 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. You can flare it, and that is what we do at Ivy. We draw the methane off the landfill and we burn it. You can see this as you go to the scales on the left-hand side of the driveway, which is, what that does is reduce it to carbon dioxide, which is a less powerful greenhouse gas. In some instances, methane is drawn off the landfills and it's captured and used as an energy source, but fugitive methane from landfills is inevitable. There's always going to be some leaking out. The second thing is leachate. Leachate is a toxic liquid that drains from the landfill site. And at Ivy and most landfills, this fluid is captured and treated to reduce any risk that it poses. but there is always a risk of groundwater contamination from leachate that gets out into the environment. So, are you all seeing this all right?
Looks great.
Okay, good. I'm not seeing the full slide with the logo for Albemarle County. In 2014, Albemarle formed a committee, the Albemarle County for Long Range Solid Waste Solutions, and they took a look at how we could provide better solid waste and recycling services in the county. The 2015 report from that committee recommended the formation of a standing committee, and that's the committee that Christine and I serve on, the Solid Waste Alternatives Advisory Committee, which is affectionately called the SWAC. There are 3 subcommittees, and Christine and I serve on the Education and Outreach Committee. We meet the second Thursday of every month, and meetings are open to the public. We also have a web page on the county website. The purpose of our group is to improve our local recycling systems and ensure the safe and affordable disposal of waste, including household hazardous waste.
So what we're hoping to get through today is we want to make sure that you know what sustainable materials waste management looks like. We want to review some of our programs that we have in Albemarle County for recycling and composting, where Albemarle County is going in the future in terms of those, details on food waste and composting programs, and how to support sustainable materials management in your everyday activities.
So in 2015, Albemarle County adopted as part of its comprehensive plan, sustainable materials management. Really, this is a new term for solid waste management and recycling, and it's more comprehensive. Sustainable materials management is a systemic approach to using and reusing materials more productively over their entire life cycles. And you see a pretty busy graphic here on the right showing a better way of using materials. At the end, there's still energy recovery or incineration and landfilling with the leftover waste. Americans generate about 4.5 pounds of waste per person per day. That's one of the highest rates in the world. And waste generation is an indirect measure of our consumption. Americans are very good consumers. So today, our materials management system is linear, and we've got to make a shift from this waste management hierarchy that you see in the slide in purple on the right to a circular economy hierarchy that while sustainable materials management works with the system we have, we need to make even more advances to a more circular economy than a linear economy.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we really need to remember is that our consumption is really directly related to climate change, and one of the biggest our biggest greenhouse emissions are associated with the food we eat, the goods we buy, our transportation, how we heat and cool our buildings. In fact, 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions are associated with the energy used to produce, transport, and dispose of food and other consumer goods. The city and the county have made a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases through their climate action plans, and sustainable material management is an important strategy for meeting our climate action goals. And next.
We seem to have skipped over a slide. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
Where's our...
I think maybe this might be an earlier...
This is an earlier version of our slide production.
Well, no matter.
Okay. So some of you may not know that we no longer have an all-in-one system combining trash and recycling in a single bin. That all-in-one system was ended in 2018. Today, the waste that's received at the IVMUC goes to a landfill in Amelia County, owned by a private operator, waste management company. Waste that's picked up in the curbside programs by haulers like County Waste goes to Chesterfield County's Shoesmith landfill, which is also privately owned. And both of these are more than 80 miles away from Charlottesville. The slide here on the right is showing the Shoesmith landfill in Chesterfield County. As far as recycling goes, using source-separated recycling, recyclables that are dropped off at McIntyre, and now at the new convenience center we have at Ivy MUC, which is just like McIntyre. It has most of the same bins and also allows for tag-a-bag trash drop-off. These recyclable materials go directly to domestic recyclers. Commingled recyclables that are picked up curbside by most of the private hauling companies that operate in the county goes to what's called a MRF, that's MRF, which stands for Materials Recovery Facility. It's sorted by machine and by hand into separate streams. And in the lower right, you see a photograph of County Waste's MRF that's located in Chesterfield County, adjacent to the Shoesmith landfill. Processing recyclables through a MRF is a little like unscrambling an egg. It's difficult to separate the different types of materials once they've been mixed together, leading to a higher degree of contamination than exists with a source-separated system. This pie chart illustrates the composition of U.S. waste in 2017. That's the most recent year for which the EPA has statistics. And the bar chart on the right illustrates the changes in the composition of our waste from 2000 to 2017. You can see in the left on the pie chart that a very large percentage of our waste is things that would be considered organic or biologic materials like food and yard waste or paper and paperboard. And in the bar charts, you can see where growth has occurred in certain categories like textiles. That's due to the rise of fast fashion. Also, plastics are a very large part of our waste. The pie chart shows plastics as 13% of our waste. That is by weight. And plastics, of course, are very light. So by volume, that's a much larger portion of our waste than you might imagine from the graphic. So what are the current trends impacting U.S. recycling? Well, due to the high contamination rate of our recyclables, our biggest recipient of scrap or recyclable materials, which was China, closed its doors to U.S. imports in 2018. When we turn to other Asian nations like Malaysia and Vietnam to take our trash instead of China, these nations also closed their doors to our, I don't mean to say trash, it's recyclable material like bottles and paper, but it often has contamination in it that makes it difficult to process. So finding domestic markets for our recyclables now is crucial. And domestic recyclers are happy to buy recyclables as feedstock as long as they're clean with a very low percentage of contamination. Source-separated recycling systems such as Ravenna's produce the highest quality recyclable materials. And to maximize value, the materials that we drop off at McIntyre and Ivy should be clean, dry, and placed in the correct bins. There are enormous greenhouse gas reduction benefits that come with recycling. Aluminum beverage cans are an example of how we can improve what we're already doing. Today, we only recycle about 50% of the aluminum cans that we use, even though aluminum is a valuable commodity and can be recycled over and over again in a closed loop. Recycling an aluminum can uses just 8% of the energy it takes to manufacture a new can. And we're showing here plastic pots, nursery pots. Very few plastics today are sought for recycling, and that's partly because of the glut in natural gas production in the US. This makes virgin plastic cheaper and easier to work with than post-consumer recycled plastic. Garden pots are often made of number 5 plastic, that's polypropylene, or number 6 plastic, polystyrene, and they're an example of plastics that's not very desirable for recycling. That's why we can't handle it at Ivy and McIntyre. Fortunately, in our community and many other communities around the States, Lowe's Garden Center will accept these pots back for recycling if they're, rinsed and fairly clean. In the next couple of slides, we just want to show you where it is that recyclables from Ravenna Solid Waste Authority go and what they're made into. For example, at the top of this slide, we have aluminum beverage containers. They're processed by Gilges metals, and they're made right back into new aluminum cans. And you can see that we send our metals to Gilges, and a lot of our paper products or fiber products, they're sometimes called, to Sunoco. We can accept PET, polyethylene number 1 plastics, and high density polyethylene plastics number 2. Of course, we take plastic film number 2 and 4, that goes to Trex and is made into decking. Glass bottles and jars, those are cleaned up. That glass is made into cullet for manufacturing new glass bottles and jars. You can drop off compostable food waste at Ivy and at McIntyre. And if you drop it off at McIntyre, it's going to go to McGill Waverly east of us. If you drop it off at Ivy, it's going to go to Black Bear for processing. And then we have a few very unusual and special things that we accept for recycling, such as oyster shells, cooking oil in some locations at McIntyre. And we have regular collections of hazardous materials. Some things that are very common, like paint, are regularly accepted for recycling at Ivy. And e-waste or electronic waste, we usually have 2 drives per year. The next one will be October 10th at Ivy MUC. The biggest problems for our recycling programs at McIntyre and Ivy are contamination, that's putting things in the wrong bins, and wish cycling, which is, if you don't know if something is recyclable, but you put it in the bin anyway with high hopes that it can be recycled, that's called wish cycling. And a lot of people are tempted to do that. The sign may not say that a garden hose or a bowling ball can go in, but you're very tempted with hopes that, hey, it's made of some kind of plastic, maybe it can be recycled with plastics. To reduce contamination, we have new signs on the recycling bins about what goes where at both Ivy and the MUC. And I urge you to take the time to look carefully at those signs. We also have attendants, both at McIntyre and Ivy. So ask them for help. They know what goes where, and they are very happy to help you. And you can also check the Ravenna Solid Waste Authority. Otherwise, we urge you to please go by the maxim, when in doubt, leave it out, in order to help reduce contamination in our recycling bins. I want to mention a common contaminant in recycling, which is plastic bags, like plastic grocery bags. Please don't tie up your recyclables in plastic bags at McIntyre or Ivy. And don't ever put plastic bags in your curbside recycling bin. Plastic bags get tangled up in the sorting machinery at the MRF and cause mechanical breakdowns. So let's see. It's a little bit more about wish cycling and recycling right. There are a number of options for recycling difficult to recycle materials around the county, such as compact fluorescent bulbs and electronic waste. You can take bulbs and batteries to Batteries and Bulbs Plus, and e-waste is accepted at Best Buy in many instances. Useful clothing can be donated to any of the thrift shops or perhaps consigned with a consignment shop. But textiles that are stained or ripped, have broken zippers or missing buttons, those textiles can still be baled and recycled through the Salvation Army or Goodwill. We have lots of plans to improve recycling in Albemarle. We are updating the county website with more information about local recycling. We are going to be trialing, we hope to, polypropylene signs. That would be rigid signs, rigid plastic signs like political signs, which we expect to be seeing a lot in this season. And they can be collected and recycled. So we're hoping to have that availability. We are debuting a app. It's a trial with a company called Better Bin that will allow you to look up a barcode of a product on your phone and find out if that product is recyclable in our system locally. And it will also help with composting to let you know what's acceptable in the compost bins. We hope to have more convenience centers similar to the new one at Ivy. We really need more facilities around the county so that everyone can participate. And right now we just have Ivy and McIntyre. So we'd like to have something to the south, to the north, and to the east of the city. And finally, we're going to be debuting a recycling ambassador program. As soon as we can be face-to-face again safely, we'll have people, volunteers at our recycling centers to answer questions and help people do the right thing and support their enthusiasm for recycling. So I'm going to hand it over to Christine now.
All right, great. Thank you, Peggy. So I'm going to focus on food waste and organic material and what we can do about it. So there are so many reasons why food waste matters. You can see that producing and wasting food consumes a whopping 21% of all fresh water, 90% of all fertilizer, 18% of cropland, and 21% of space in the landfill by volume. And you can see that this graph right here shows the generation of CO2 emitted by various foods during the production phase, as shown in the green bar graph. This reflects the energy used to feed and care for livestock or to grow the crops before either one of them actually leaves the farm. So it's tremendous. The post-production phase, as shown in orange, includes processing, transportation, retail, cooking, and waste disposal. So if you consider, let's say, 1 kilogram of beef, most of the energy used to produce this is expended before the cow even leaves the farm. The CO2 emitted by the production of a kilogram of beef is enormous compared to the production, for example, of a kilogram of lentils. So you can see why eating less meat is an important part of addressing climate change. And considering the vast amount of resources required to produce our food, it is a shame to waste any of it. But sadly, about 150 tons of food is thrown out by American households every day. That represents about a third of the food calories we typically consume. This waste has an environmental toll beyond the landfill because, in fact, it took about 30 million acres of land, 780 180 million pounds of pesticide, and 4.2 trillion gallons of irrigated water to produce that food that is sadly thrown away. All right, next slide. But there are steps that we can take to prevent food waste. In 2016, the EPA and the USDA launched the Food Recovery Challenge with the goal to reduce food waste by 50% by the year 2030. In addition, there's a multi-stakeholder nonprofit called ReFed is using the data-driven approach to create a roadmap to prevent, reduce, and recycle food waste. So if we were to start with prevention, 90% of Americans tend to throw food out when it's still safe to eat. This is done in a large part to the confusion caused by misleading food package labels such as sell by, use by, buy dates. So standardized labeling could help clear up this confusion. So that's one thing we can do to prevent. And then this idea of recovery, donating, repurposing, if we were to donate or repurpose just 15% of the food that would otherwise be thrown out, we could feed as many as 25 million people in the US. And then lastly, and finally, we should aim to make sure that any food that is no longer edible is recycled through composting rather than being sent to the landfill. All right, next slide. So why is composting food so important in terms of climate change? This has to do with how organic material breaks down when oxygen is available and when it is not. When you put food waste in the landfill, it breaks down anaerobically or without oxygen to produce CO2 and methane. And Peggy talked about this earlier. Methane is a much more powerful heat-trapping greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And the EPA estimates that about a third of methane emissions comes from landfills. Now, on the other hand, properly composted organic material decomposes aerobically with oxygen, only producing carbon dioxide and no methane. So you can see from this graph that there's a tremendous benefit to keeping food waste out of the landfill in terms of climate change. Next slide. So composting uses microorganisms like bacteria and fungus to break down organic material. The speed and efficiency of this process is dependent on key factors like nutrient balance, having the proper ratio of brown material, which is carbon rich, to green material, which is rich in nitrogen. Other key factors include moisture, oxygen, temperature, and particle size. Composting recycles important nutrients. It plays a vital role in improving the health of our soils by improving moisture retention and adding nutrients. And therefore, it reduces the need for chemical fertilizers and watering. You can apply compost to your lawn, flower beds, or vegetable garden. Healthy soil produces healthy plants that are more resistant to pests and disease. And I can attest, the compost makes my garden grow so much better. All right, next slide. So it is fairly easy to set up a backyard compost system if you pay attention to the key factors that I mentioned earlier. You can also get some help from worms by setting up a worm bin, which is useful even if you have limited outdoor space. You could actually even set one in a closet, and they're quite fun. I actually have chickens that help me turn my food scraps, my grass clippings, and weeds into nutrient-rich additive for my garden. And as an added bonus, my hens provide me with a few delicious and nutritious eggs every day. Next slide. Of course, there are limits to the backyard compost bin. So we are not going to be able to reach the high temperatures that are necessary to break down compostable plant-based plastics or to destroy weed seeds. And if you try to compost meat, dairy, or fatty foods, it could attract unwanted pests and produce unpleasant odors. So next slide. So given the limitations of the backyard compost bin, one should consider taking advantage of the programs at McIntyre and Ivy. The food waste collected there is taken to an industrial composting facility, which is managed to effectively break down materials like plant-based plastics, meat, dairy, and fats. And you can see from this list that if one could, if you were to compost so many of those items, including, napkins and towels, compostable packaging, that you could really reduce what ends up in the landfill by using this free service. All right, next slide. Now, I'm just going to start with pizza boxes because they really are problematic to recycle. When I have a pizza box, I tear the box in half and I recycle the top half. The grease-soaked bottom half should not go into the recycle bin, but it can be composted. And there is a special bin at McIntyre for composting the greasy part of your pizza boxes. And seasonally, Christmas trees are collected and mulched. The resulting mulch is free to the public, and Halloween pumpkins are collected and composted as well. All right, next slide. Oh, we're going to actually skip over this and the next one, I think. One more. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to skip over some of the details of those different systems. So if you live in the city, you should consider participating in a pilot drop-off program with collection bins that are strategically placed around the city of Charlottesville. The city also provides free curbside leaf pickup. And those leaves are taken to Panorama Farm in Earlysville, which uses an industrial process to take the leaves, which are rich in carbon, and they add chicken litter, which is rich in nitrogen, and they produce a great finished compost. All right, next slide. So here we are with our yard waste and leaves. So every year, about 8 million tons of leaves sadly end up in the landfill. Leaves and yard debris account for about 13% of our waste stream. But leaves play a vital role in natural ecosystems. Critters ranging from turtles and toads to birds, mammals, and invertebrates rely on leaf litter for food, shelter, and nesting material. And many moss and butterfly caterpillars overwinter in fallen leaves before emerging in the spring. Brush piles create really great shelter for birds, and those piles will really disappear before you know it. So if you don't have space to pile up your yard debris, you can take it to the Ivy Material Utilization Center for a small fee. There it will be ground into mulch, and this mulch can then be purchased to use in your yard. All right, next slide. We're lucky to have Black Bear Composting, who offers a subscription curbside collection service for Charlottesville, Crozet, and the Albemarle Urban Ring. The great thing about this is it has the added benefit of each month delivering a batch of finished compost to your door, ready to apply to your garden or lawn. Next slide. So recycling works best when there is a market for the recycled end product. So we encourage you to purchase finished compost from these local sources. And you can see you can get some at the Ivy landfill. And I believe Panorama Pay Dirt is offered in several of the gardening stores around Charlottesville. Next slide. All right. Well, especially in this time of COVID, there's been an increase in food takeout. But there are things that we can do to reduce the negative impact that comes with takeout packaging. We can support the businesses that limit waste and package the food in compostable containers. and say no thanks to some of those unneeded items. For example, if you don't need forks and spoons, you're taking it home, you can use your own utensils. You just say, I don't need any utensils. Check the labels for proper disposal. Some of the bagasse, which are these kind of brownish, a lot of people use plates and bowls, or these alternative fibers can actually be composted in your backyard compost bin. But there are many items that cannot, especially plant-based plastics. And what's really important is you want to make sure that you're keeping compostable containers out of the recycling bin, because they're a big source of contamination. And it becomes very confusing when you look at a cup and you just, is this petroleum plastic or is it a plant-based plastic? So you really have to look for the labels. And the last part of this is really remembering that all packaging has an environmental impact, even if it is recyclable or compostable. So we really got to think about limiting the amount that we use. All right, next slide. All right, so I want to encourage you to check out the Better World Betty website, where you'll find lots of useful tips on how to be a better steward of the environment. For example, you can find a list of local restaurants that offer low waste takeout packaging. And if you have a favorite restaurant that packages their takeout in styrofoam, you may want to give them a nudge to switch to a compostable packaging. And you can find a blog post on the Better World Betty website with a sample letter to help you make your case. I actually did this, and I was so pleased because it was with the food truck. And a couple weeks later, they completely gotten rid of all their styrofoam and they started using compostable containers. So it was very exciting. So it's important to let restaurants know that you patronize, know that you care about how your food is packaged. Your feedback can really be a powerful tool for change. All right, next slide. All right, so we talked a lot, about examining our consumer choices to reduce waste. And I just wanted to share with you my own personal waste challenge and how I was able to reduce what I sent to the landfill really to just a small little grocery bag. And, how did I do it? Well, I try to buy in bulk, but when you do that, it's important to not purchase more than you'll use so that you don't throw out the stuff that gets too old past those labeling dates that I talked about earlier. And then using reusable bags and containers. And when you do shop in bulk, often you can just take your jar with you and refill it. I make my own yogurt, and I'm lucky to have a big garden, so I'm able to can and freeze and dry a lot of that produce. And this is especially useful if you are a member of a CSA or you get out and support some of our local orchards. In terms of beverages, it's very satisfying to, I make my own kombucha, so I use the same bottles over and over again. Next slide. And of course, as a gardener, I've found some creative ways to repurpose materials as well, even making this kind of fun bottle ball. Next slide. So as we bring our presentation to a close, we want to thank you for participating. The fact that you're here and listening and concerned and interested to know more says a lot about you. And so we want to encourage you to, and everybody, to think about our own consumption, educate yourself on the actions you can take that can make the greatest difference, and maybe even considering taking your own waste reduction challenge. And when you do, share your experience with others. Modeling behavior is a big part of creating the culture of stewardship. Next slide. And of course, there are so many other things, right? Supporting local businesses, asking them about their sustainable practices, letting them know that you care. If you've got your favorite national brand, investigate them, look into their sustainable practices, and then let them know that the recyclability and recycled content of the materials that's used to make the product is important to you, and vote with your dollars. We'd love to have you come and volunteer to become a recycling ambassador once we get that program up and running. We also want to encourage you to contact your Board of Supervisor or City Council member and let them know that you support sustainable materials management practices. And I know Peggy perhaps could talk a little bit if there's anybody's interested in some of the legislation that was passed in the General Assembly and the possibility of a styrofoam ban and or a tax on plastic bags. And we also just want to invite you to join our SWAC meetings. They occur on the second Thursday again of each month, and maybe even consider joining. So we just want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our presentation, and we really are excited to hear your questions. And on the next slide, we have provided a list of useful, hopefully useful resources and websites. And Evan is going to make the presentation available to you because I know we went through a lot of material. And so we are excited to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Peggy Christine. Very informative.